Welcome back from the break. My name is Ray Ford, working with SBIA, and I'll be your host and moderator for today's sessions. We hope you're able to refresh your coffee or tea as we move into our presentations. Our first presentation in this session will be on the biosimilar program updates and what's new under BsUFA 3. Our presenters are Dr. Stacey Ricci, who's the Director of Scientific Review Staff in the Office of Therapeutic Biologics and Biosimilars within the Office of New Drugs, CDER, and Dr. Kimberly Maxfield. She's the BsUFA Regulatory Science Program Coordinator in the Office of Therapeutic Biologics and Biosimilars and O&D. Our final presentation before the Q&A panel is on FDA formal meetings. What's new under PDUFA, BsUFA, and OMUFA? Our presenter, Elizabeth Thompson, is the Chief of Project Management Staff in the Division of Regulatory Operations for Non-Prescription Drugs, Office of Regulatory Operations, and O&D. For a complete biography on each presenter today, please refer to our speaker biographies located in the same area on our website as the conference agenda. Now, please join me to welcome our first presenter in this session, Dr. Ricci.
Hello, my name is Stacey Ricci, and Dr. Kimberly Maxfield and I both work with our talented colleagues in the Office of Therapeutic Biologics and Biosimilars. Thank you for joining us today for a presentation on several exciting updates about FDA's biosimilar program. Today's presentation will provide a status update on our review of biosimilar and interchangeable products, explain several enhancements to FDA's biosimilar program introduced under the third authorization of the biosimilar user fee amendments, including a new regulatory science program. We'll also describe recent legislative updates affecting biosimilars and highlight progress we've made to increase our educational outreach to patients and providers. This slide shows a timeline of all U.S. biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilar approvals. Since the passage of the Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act in 2010 created an abbreviated approval pathway for biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilar products, their development has undergone steady growth from the first biosimilar approved in 2015 to a total of 40 biosimilars approved today, 4 of which are interchangeable. These products can be used across many different therapeutic areas to treat a wide range of diseases and conditions, including the side effects of chemotherapy, breast, lung, and colon cancer, hematologic malignancies, autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Crohn's disease, and ulcerative colitis, plus diabetes, macular degeneration, and many others, and the list continues to grow. 29 of these products are currently marketed in the U.S. We expect many of the adalimumab biosimilars to be marketed this year, which should increase biosimilar uptake and availability nationwide. Other metrics to note are the 102 proposed biosimilars under review in active biosimilar development programs, and that FDA has met with companies to discuss proposed biosimilars to 53 different reference products. And now for some updates introduced under BsUFA 3. We are in the third iteration of the biosimilar user fee program, and this included 10 areas of focused enhancement. Today, we will discuss 3 of those enhancement areas highlighted here: the new BLA supplement categories specific to biosimilar programs, addition of timelines for human factor analysis and protocol review, and the new regulatory science pilot program. There are now 6 new supplementary BLA categories, A through F. These include expedited review timelines for safety labeling updates and labeling updates to add or remove an indication, where FDA does not need to review new efficacy data. If review of efficacy data is necessary, the timeline is 10 months from receipt date. These new categories allow for a more structured review process, which helps FDA meet review timeline goals. OTBB is responsible for the review and management of all Category A, B, and C supplements currently, and will be taking on more of this workload in the future. Details about the BsUFA 3 supplement categories are summarized in the next two slides, with the A, B, and C on this slide and the D, E, and F on the next. The first column describes the contents of the different supplements. The second column summarizes review timelines, and the last column captures the target dates for issuing acknowledgement letters for Category A through C and filing letters for Categories D through F. A Category A supplement will update the labeling with safety information that has been updated in the reference product labeling. Category B supplements are to add an indication when the conditions listed here apply. Category C supplements are seeking to remove an approved indication. Category D and E supplements are also to add an additional indication when the conditions here listed apply. And Category F supplements are those seeking an initial determination of interchangeability. Consistent with PDUFA 7, 60-day timelines were formalized for the review of use-related risk analyses and human factor study protocols related to biologic device combination products. The BsUFA 3 commitments also include publishing guidance on specific topics. During year one, FDA has committed to revise the guidance about formal meetings between FDA sponsors, issue new guidance about Category A through F BLA supplement categories, and on labeling for interchangeable biosimilar products. FDA will also issue draft guidance on the use of alternative tools to assess manufacturing facilities named in pending applications and update relevant guidances, maps, and SOPs as appropriate regarding best practices in communication during application review. By year two, FDA will publish guidance on the topic of use-related risk analyses and human factor validation studies for biosimilar device combination products, one on promotional labeling and advertising considerations for interchangeable biosimilar products, and on the different reporting categories for post-approval manufacturing changes. By year three, FDA will publish guidance describing considerations for developing presentations, container closure systems, and device constituent parts for proposed interchangeable biosimilar products. I'll hand the presentation over to Kimberly, who will discuss the new regulatory science program created under BsUFA 3.
Thanks, Stacey. For the next few slides, I will provide a high-level overview of the Regulatory Science Pilot Program commitment under BsUFA 3. Outlined in the commitment letter, the FDA agreed to pilot a regulatory research program that focused on improving the efficiency of biosimilar development and advancing the development of interchangeable products. Given that the goals or demonstration projects outlined in the commitment letter are very broad, we formed a BsUFA Regulatory Science Subcommittee to come up with how the research program should improve the efficiency of biosimilar development and advance the development of interchangeable products. Our subcommittee identified two areas for regulatory impact that will help achieve the demonstration projects outlined in the commitment letter. These are pictorially shown here as a shift in paradigm of the 351K data package. On the left, we have the current 351K data package paradigm, showing the components product quality, comparative analytical assessment, clinical pharmacology, and comparative clinical studies. Through the regulatory research program, as well as other components of BsUFA 3, we envision that data package to rely more heavily on the comparative analytical assessment and less so on clinical data. As such, there are the two regulatory impact identified are: one, developing alternatives to and/or reducing the size of studies involving human subjects, and two, enhancing the efficiency of the analytical and CMC characterization. With these more clearly defined regulatory impacts or goals, we were able to identify then 10 research topics or priorities where advancement is expected to impact FDA's evidence-based recommendations and/or regulatory decision-making. I won't read all 10 research priorities here, There's a link on the bottom of this slide where you can go to the research roadmap that was published publicly. Also note how each research priority is specific to one of the regulatory impacts that will help achieve the goals in the commitment letter. The structure of these relationships between the priorities, the regulatory impact, and the demonstration projects will serve as a framework for the pilot program to report outcomes and metrics of success. Additionally, the bottom gray box highlights an array of methodologies that can be employed to address any of the research priorities. These include analytical methods, biological assays, efficient clinical trial design, such as statistical methods, in silico and in vitro modeling, model-informed drug development, real-world data/evidence, and pharmacological studies. The BsUFA 3 commitment letter also outlines key deliverables for the research pilot program. There are 4 main deliverables: the interim report on progress of the pilot program, which is coupled with an interim public meeting, both on or before October 30th, 2025. There was a final report due before the end of BsUFA 3 and a final strategy document due within 12 months of completion of the demonstration projects in the pilot program. In addition to these deliverables that are outlined in the commitment letter, we are also doing additional stakeholder engagement through the continuous engagement meetings, public comments on the current roadmap, and other speaking events. Thus far, we have held 2 external funding opportunities as part of the program. The first was in fiscal year 22, where we funded 5 grants that I will briefly review in the next slide. Our second cycle just closed on April 26, 2023. The submitted applications are currently undergoing the objective review process. Our goal is to highlight the work from both of these funding cycles at the interim public meeting. Here is a list of the 5 grants that were funded in fiscal year 22 from academic, not-for-profit, and for-profit entities. The breadth and research topics covered by these grants includes developing alternatives to the comparative immunogenicity assessment currently conducted as part of the comparative clinical study and/or switching study. These projects contribute to the goal of developing alternatives to and/or reducing the size of studies involving human subjects. Additionally, we have projects assessing the impact of differences of biosimilars in reference product presentations and container closure systems, looking at standardizing approaches for assessing and reporting product quality attributes, and improving on analytical technologies. All of these can contribute to the goal of enhancing the efficiency of analytical and CMC characterization. Thank you all for your attention, and I will pass the presentation back to Stacey.
Thanks, Kimberly. Shifting gears, I'll now address a few recent legislative changes affecting biosimilars. By passing the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, or FDORA, Congress modified the general requirements for the data needed to demonstrate biosimilarity by replacing the language in the Public Health Service Act regarding animal studies with an assessment of toxicity, which may rely on data derived from analytical or clinical studies. FDORA also modified the first interchangeable exclusivity provisions to clarify that 1, if several first interchangeable products are approved on the same day, they each qualify for first interchangeable exclusivity. And 2, when a subsequent application for an interchangeable product is blocked by first interchangeable exclusivity, FDA can approve that application as a biosimilar. FDORA also amended the FD&C Act to include biological products. These changes align certain reporting requirements for biologics with the reporting requirements for drugs by requiring holders of approved BLAs to report to FDA when a biological product is discontinued from sale or has never been available for sale. BLA holders are also required to submit a one-time marketing status report by June 27th of this year to confirm that their products listed in the Purple Book are still available for sale. Next, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the materials and information FDA has released or made available for healthcare providers about biosimilar and interchangeable products, and talk a little bit about our commitment to stakeholder outreach. Education and outreach is an important component of the work we do at FDA to increase understanding of biosimilars. We do this through several ways: material development and testing, and engaging with stakeholders such as patient advocacy organizations, healthcare provider organizations, and clinical societies and payers. But FDA cannot do all this alone. The stakeholders also have a responsibility to educate their members, and we support that work by presenting to their audiences, reviewing materials, and providing educational materials. This slide has samples of the educational materials we have released for healthcare providers and shows the 3 most recent fact sheets we have released. These are our overview of biosimilars, regulatory and approval, and interchangeability. But we also have infographics and videos that provide information about biosimilar and interchangeable products. FDA recently released updated materials for patients, including a new infographic, a web page, and 2 fact sheets. One is geared toward patients with diabetes, and the other fact sheet is a general overview. These are also available in Spanish. The patient materials use patient-friendly language to build a foundation of basic understanding, and also to address topics, concerns, and misconceptions shown to be most important to patients, such as the safety and effectiveness of biosimilars, why biosimilars cannot be exactly copied, and the regulatory review process. We have other materials available in Spanish, including the biosimilar basics infographics, the USP and FTC materials that will be highlighted in the coming slides, in addition to the FDA Biosimilars Consumer Update. We are also looking into translating our materials into more languages. One of our most comprehensive resources is our Biosimilar Curriculum Toolkit that was designed to help educate students in healthcare professional degree programs, such as medical schools, nursing, physician assistant schools, pharmacy schools. This toolkit provides teaching faculty and other interested stakeholders with a variety of educational resources to help them understand, apply, and teach concepts related to biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilars, along with information about their corresponding regulatory approval pathway in the United States. The modular toolkit is designed to meet a variety of teaching and educational needs and contains foundational as well as more in-depth information by levels. Level 1 materials provide a high-level overview of foundational biosimilar topics, and Level 2 materials provide an in-depth look at scientific and regulatory information. We also have 4 continuing education courses released with Medscape to enhance understanding of biosimilars through a series of accredited CE courses for healthcare providers, including doctors, pharmacists, and nurses. And these cover a broad range of topics about biosimilar and interchangeable products and vary in length and time commitment. Some examples of recent work with stakeholders are that we partnered with the U.S. Pharmacopoeia, USP, to develop an infographic on biosimilars with a focus on quality. We are also working with the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, to develop a more consumer-focused fact sheet. And as discussed before, we continually present to various stakeholders and participate as panelists to reach multiple audiences. I also want to highlight that this year we will release additional patient materials, including a video for healthcare providers, in addition to working on additional Medscape CE courses, and we also plan to add to our curriculum toolkit in the next year. I'll wrap things up by sharing direct links to these and other FDA resources that are available online, where you can find out more information about biosimilar and interchangeable biosimilar products, including the curriculum, information at Drugs at FDA, and information in the Purple Book, which includes information on all FDA-licensed biological products regulated by both CDER and CBER. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, and thank you for attending today's session. My name is Elizabeth Thompson, and I am the Chief Project Manager in the Office of Regulatory Operations, Division of Regulatory Operations for Non-Prescription Drugs 2. My presentation today is on FDA formal meetings, what's new under PDUFA, BsUFA, and OMUFA. Today I will discuss what's new with prescription drug and biosimilar product meetings following the recent reauthorizations of those user fee programs. In addition, I'll cover the over-the-counter monograph meetings, which are midway through their first authorization. I'll provide an update on FDA formal meeting formats to include where CDER stands on face-to-face meetings at White Oak. And last, I'll provide several meeting tips and best practices. Please note that this presentation will not include meeting updates related to generic drugs under PDUFA, nor will it be an in-depth presentation on all FDA formal meeting types and formats. The objective for today's session is to focus on what new meeting types have been added or how meetings have changed during the recent reauthorizations. I'll begin with prescription drugs and will outline some of the new meeting types under the reauthorization of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or PDUFA 7, which began on October 1st, 2022, and covers fiscal years 2023 through 2027. PDUFA 7 reauthorization introduced several new meeting types that include Type D meetings, initial targeted engagement for regulatory advice on CBER or CDER products, or what we call interact meetings, and follow-up opportunity. On the next couple of slides, I will provide more detail on these new meeting types and why they were created. I also want to note that FDA will be issuing a revised draft guidance to include these new meeting types and expects to publish the draft guidance by September 30th of this year. So let's take a deeper look at each of these three new meeting types. A Type D meeting is focused on a narrow set of issues to obtain timely FDA feedback at key decision points beyond milestone meetings. Type D meetings are appropriate for one, but typically not more than two issues and associated questions. If the sponsor has several issues or a complex single issue with multiple questions, a Type C meeting should be requested rather than requesting several Type D meetings. In addition, the issue should not require input from more than 3 disciplines or divisions. If the scope of the meeting is broad or includes complex questions or issues that require input from more than 3 disciplines or divisions, then FDA will inform the sponsor that the agency will be converting the meeting to the appropriate meeting type, whether that be a Type B or Type C meeting, and the sponsor can either withdraw their request or accept the FDA's meeting type conversion without submitting a new request. Some examples of appropriate requests for Type D meetings include a follow-up question that raises a new issue after a formal meeting and is more than just a clarifying question about an FDA response from a prior meeting, a narrow issue on which the sponsor is seeking agency input with only a few associated questions, or a general question about an innovative development approach that does not require extensive detailed advice. Interact meetings are intended for novel questions and unique challenges in early development. In other words, prior to submission of an IND, that would delay the progress of the product towards clinical development in the absence of this early FDA input. And these issues typically relate to IND requirements. The sponsor needs to have selected a specific investigational product or a product derivation strategy to evaluate in a clinical study before requesting an Interact meeting. Questions and topics within the scope of an Interact meeting include novel questions for products where there is no existing guidance or other information in writing the company could reference, and FDA input on issues that a sponsor needs to address prior to a pre-IND meeting. Some examples of when to request an Interact meeting might include discussion on the appropriate preclinical models or necessary toxicology studies for novel drug platforms or drug candidates, CMC issues or testing strategies aimed to demonstrate product safety or adequacy to support a first-in-human study, development of innovative devices used with the product or use of cutting-edge testing methodologies, advice related to the design of proof of concept or other pilot studies necessary to support administration of an investigational product in a first-in-human clinical trial, general recommendations regarding a future first-in-human trial in a target clinical population where the population is novel and there is no prior precedent or guidance, and recommendations on approach for further development of an early-stage product with limited CMC, non-clinical, and/or clinical data that were collected outside of a U.S. IND. Written follow-up opportunity is to ensure the sponsor's understanding of FDA feedback from previous meeting discussions or a written response. Only questions of a clarifying nature will be permitted. In other words, to confirm something in meeting minutes or a written response issued by FDA, rather than raising new issues or new proposals. FDA will develop criteria and parameters for permissible requests, and FDA may exercise discretion about whether these requests are in scope. The clarifying question should be submitted officially to the application as a request for clarification within 20 calendar days following receipt of meeting minutes or a written response. For questions that meet the criteria, FDA will issue a response in writing within 20 calendar days of receipt of these clarifying questions. FDA's response will reference the original meeting minutes or written response. Please note that FDA's response does not need to be included in a formal letter. To finish my discussion on formal meetings under PDUFA, I've included a slide that shows meeting types and the pertinent goal dates associated with them. I have listed all PDUFA meeting types here, but will focus on only the new meeting types I outlined earlier, which are listed here in bold. For Type D meetings, FDA will respond within 14 days of receipt of the meeting request. The meeting will be scheduled within, or a written response will be issued within 50 days of receipt. Background packages are due at the time of the meeting request, and preliminary comments, if applicable, will be issued 5 days before the meeting. Please note that if FDA has granted the meeting as written responses only, preliminary comments will not be issued. For Interact meetings, FDA will respond within 21 days of receipt of the meeting request, and the meeting will be scheduled within, or a written response will be issued within, 75 days of receipt. Background packages, like Type D meetings, are due at the time of the request, and if applicable, Preliminary comments will be issued 5 days before the meeting. For follow-up opportunities, a request for clarification should be submitted within 20 calendar days following the receipt of FDA's meeting minutes or a written response. FDA will respond within 20 days if the request is within scope. Next, I'll discuss biosimilars and will outline some of the new meeting types or meeting changes under the reauthorization of the Biosimilar User Fee Act, or BsUFA 3, which began on October 1st, 2022, and covers fiscal years 2023 through 2027. BsUFA 3 reauthorization introduced 2 new meeting types: Biological Product Development, or what we call BPD, Type 2A, and Follow-up Opportunity. I'll note here that the previous BPD Type 2 meetings are now Type 2B. Type 2A meetings will be focused on a narrow set of issues, often 1, but not more than 2 issues and associated questions, and requiring input from no more than 3 disciplines or review divisions. Type 2A meetings have a shorter review cycle, which is 60 days, than the previous Type 2 meetings, which were 90 days. Consistent with PDUFA meetings, there is a follow-up opportunity where sponsors may submit clarifying questions within 20 days after a meeting or a written response to ensure understanding of FDA feedback. BsUFA 3 reauthorization also introduced a few changes to existing meetings. Notably, there is a change with the Biosimilar Initial Advisory, or BIA, meetings, where preliminary comparative analytical data comparing the proposed biosimilar to the U.S. reference product will no longer be required. However, sufficient information should be provided with the meeting request to enable FDA to make a preliminary determination related to potential licensure under Section 351K and to provide meaningful advice. Additionally, there are timing changes with respect to when meeting packages can be submitted for a Type 4 meeting, which can now be submitted 14 days after the meeting request. Previously, the meeting package had to be submitted with the meeting request. I also want to note one other change related to biosimilar meetings, which deals with user fees. There is a new change under BsUFA 3 related to the initial BPD fee. The timeline for paying this fee to join the program was increased from 5 days to 7 days after receipt of the meeting granted letter from FDA. In addition, FDA will be issuing a revised draft guidance to include these new meeting types and meeting changes and expects to publish the draft guidance by September 30th of this year. This slide shows all BsUFA meeting types and pertinent goal dates. Again, I've listed all BsUFA meeting types, but will focus on the new meeting types I outlined earlier, and again are shown here in bold. For a BPD Type 2A meeting, FDA will respond to the meeting request within 21 days. The meeting will be scheduled within, or a written response will be issued within, 60 days of receipt. Background packages are due at the time of the meeting request, and preliminary comments, if applicable, will be issued 2 days before the meeting. Again, please note that if FDA has granted the meeting as written response only, preliminary comments will not be issued. For a BPD Type 4 meeting, background packages may now be submitted up to 14 days after FDA receipt of meeting request, instead of previously being due at the time of the meeting request. And consistent with PDUFA follow-up opportunity, sponsors may submit clarifying questions within 20 days following receipt of meeting minutes or a written response. FDA will respond within 20 days if the request is within scope. Last, I'll discuss monograph meetings, which are currently under the first authorization of the new user fee program referred to as the Over-the-Counter Monograph User Fee Act, or OMUFA, which began October 1st, 2020, and covers fiscal years 2021 through 2025. FDA issued a draft guidance titled Formal Meetings between FDA and Sponsors or Requesters of Over-the-Counter Monograph Drugs. This guidance specifies the principles and procedures for formal meetings between FDA and meeting requesters. It establishes procedures under which meeting requesters can meet with FDA to obtain advice on the studies and other information necessary to support submissions under Section 505G, to obtain advice on other matters relevant to the regulation of non-prescription drugs, and to obtain advice on the development of new OTC monograph drugs. The guidance also establishes procedures to facilitate efficient participation in joint meetings by multiple meeting requesters and/or organizations nominated by them to represent their interests. In addition, a webinar hosted by FDA on March 27, 2022 can be referenced and will provide a more in-depth overview of the draft guidance on monograph meetings. Today, I want to provide a brief overview of monograph meeting types and associated timelines. Currently, there are 3 monograph formal meeting types: Type X, Type Y, and Type Z. We will take a deeper look into these meeting types on the next slide. A Type X meeting is a meeting that is necessary for an otherwise stalled over-the-counter monograph order development program to proceed. For example, this could be a meeting that is requested within 3 months of FDA issuing a refuse to file letter for an over-the-counter monograph order request, or OMOR, or after FDA has declined to issue an administrative order. A Type X meeting is also a meeting that is necessary to address an important safety issue that needs immediate action when the meeting requester learns about a safety issue related to an OTC monograph drug that is marketed or being developed. A Type Y meeting is a meeting intended for milestone discussions during the course of the over-the-counter monograph order development program for monograph ingredients and monograph conditions of use. Examples of appropriate circumstances for Type Y meetings include a meeting to discuss the overall data requirements to support a grades determination or overall data requirements to support an OMOR. Or a pre-OMOR or pre-submission meeting may also be requested when nearing completion of the development program for an OMOR. These pre-submission meetings are intended to present a summary of the data supporting the OMOR, discuss the proposed format for the OMOR, obtain FDA feedback on the adequacy of the proposal of the OMOR submission, and discuss the appropriate categorization of an OMOR, for example, Tier 1 or Tier 2. Type Y pre-OMOR meetings should be held sufficiently in advance of the planned submission of the OMOR to allow for meaningful response to FDA feedback and should generally occur not less than 3 months before the planned OMOR. And last, Type Z meetings are any meetings that are not Type X or Type Y. This slide shows the performance goals associated with monograph meetings. Once a meeting is received, FDA will respond to the request within 14 days for a Type X or Type Y meeting and 21 days for a Type C meeting. FDA will schedule the meeting or issue a written response either 30 days from receipt for a Type X, 70 days for a Type Y, and 75 days for a Type C. Meeting packages are due at the time of a meeting request for Type X meetings and either 50 days before the meeting or written response goal date for Type Y, or 47 days for a Type Z meeting. FDA will generally not send preliminary responses for Type X meetings and will issue preliminary responses 5 days before the meeting for Type Y and Type C meetings. Now I'd like to discuss the types of formal meeting formats that are available and also provide some updates on these formats, in particular for face-to-face meetings. Please note that my discussion on the next several slides regarding face-to-face meetings include meetings under PDUFA, BsUFA, and OMUFA. CDER formal meeting formats are available as face-to-face, teleconference, or written response only. The PDUFA 7 and BsUFA 3 commitment letters provided an update to the definition of face-to-face formal meetings with industry. This update clarifies that a face-to-face meeting includes both in-person meetings and virtual meetings on IT platforms that allow for both audio and visual communication. In other words, a face-to-face meeting between FDA and industry is defined as either in-person or virtual with cameras on, what we are calling video conferences. While OMUFA does not have this formal definition, monograph meetings may also be conducted in person or using the virtual meeting format, allowing for both audio and visual communication. FDA is in the process of updating our formal meeting guidance documents to reflect this revised definition. In the interim, we are highlighting this change on our public website to help reduce uncertainties on this point. Note that in-person face-to-face meetings can have a hybrid component, with some participants joining remotely in order to accommodate participants that can't be fully in person. I will go into more detail on the next slide and provide updates on where CDER stands on in-person meetings as conference rooms at White Oak are being updated with the latest audio-visual equipment to support these hybrid meetings. In early 2023, CDER staff began transitioning to a hybrid workplace, with staff returning to work on-site at the White Oak campus for a portion of their work time. This transition has enabled some face-to-face hybrid in-person formal meetings between FDA and industry. To support hybrid meetings, White Oak conference rooms are being upgraded in phases over the course of 2023 with new technology, for example, noise-canceling microphones and face conversation tracking video cameras. To avoid overcrowding in the conference rooms, FDA will focus on having only core participants with the primary speaking role in person while others join virtually. FDA encourages industry to follow this same pattern. Therefore, all face-to-face in-person formal meetings will have a hybrid component, virtual attendees in addition to in-person attendees. The availability of hybrid conference rooms will initially limit the number of in-person meeting requests that can be granted. The number of meetings that can be granted and held in person with a hybrid component will increase as conference rooms are upgraded over the course of 2023. Updates on FDA's transition to face-to-face in-person formal meetings will be communicated in advance on the FDA.gov website. On February 13, 2023, due to the initially limited availability of upgraded conference rooms, CDER began scheduling face-to-face in-person industry meetings with a hybrid component, starting with Type A, BPD Type 1, and Type X meetings. Face-to-face meeting requests for other meeting types, if granted, will be held as virtual or what we call video conference meetings, and the in-person format will not be considered. As FDA is gaining experience with the hybrid meetings and technology, we've learned that the ideal number of in-person attendees or core participants is 12 people total. This can be 6 from FDA and 6 from industry, or a mix thereof. This number ensures in-person attendees can be seated in the room in a way that maximizes the use of the audiovisual equipment. CDER will be monitoring conference room upgrades monthly, and as upgrades are completed, we will transition in phases such that all types of face-to-face formal meetings can be considered for in-person. For example, phase 2 of this transition would permit additional face-to-face formal meeting types other than Type A, BPD Type 1, and Type X to be considered for in-person scheduling. The final phase of this transition will enable any face-to-face formal meeting to be considered for in-person format. Before I close out my presentation, I wanted to offer a few meeting tips and best practices for your consideration. Before meeting with FDA, sponsors should refer to FDA's guidances on PDUFA, BsUFA, and monograph meetings. I've included links to these guidances in my resources slide. Communicate with your assigned regulatory project manager, or RPM, and ask questions if you have them before you submit your meeting request. Notify the RPM of any changes to meeting attendees. Your meeting package should be clear, concise, and focused on the meeting discussion topics or issues. If you change your agenda after receiving FDA's preliminary comments, please alert the RPM assigned to your meeting. Also, do not add new topics or issues to the agenda. If you have slides or handouts, please provide those to the RPM before the meeting. And last, during the meeting, sponsors should remember that this is your meeting. Take the lead and be cognizant of the time if you have materials to present. Make sure your questions are addressed and be sure to summarize any agreements, discussion points, and action items. On the next couple of slides, I've provided some resources related to today's discussion. On this slide, you will find links to FDA's draft guidances for formal meetings for PDUFA, BsUFA, and monograph meetings, as well as the webinar on the draft guidance for monograph meetings that I mentioned earlier. I've also included the commitment letters, which outlines the performance goals and procedures for PDUFA, BsUFA, and OMUFA. These goal letters or commitment letters represent the product of FDA's discussions with regulated industry and public stakeholders, as mandated by Congress. You will find the meeting information I discussed here today in these letters, as well as many other aspects of the Human Drug Review programs. In addition, I've provided the link to stay updated on FDA's progress with in-person meetings. That concludes my presentation today. I want to thank everyone for attending, and I will be happy to address any questions. Thank you.
Thank you all for the great presentations. For our attendees, if you haven't had a chance to enter your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. Looks like we have a few questions coming in right now. Moving into our first panelist, we have a few questions that came in for Dr. Stacey Ricci. And here is the first question for Dr. Ricci. With the change to the PHS Act introduced by FDORA, can you explain why animal studies are no longer required for the demonstration of biosimilarity?
Hi, thank you for that question. So this is an important question because there's a lot of confusion around whether animal studies are required to support a demonstration of biosimilarity. And this change in the statutory language codifies the practice that FDA has used for many years now where we do not require animal studies to support the demonstration of biosimilarity, because it was identified soon after the Biosimilar Price Competition and Innovation Act was passed in 2010 that animal studies were very insensitive for detecting differences between products. So this change in the statutory language just codifies our standard practice. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have a few more questions for Dr. Ricci, and here is the next question. Are interchangeable biosimilars better than biosimilars?
Thank you. That's another great question and another point of confusion. FDA's approval of an interchangeable product does not indicate a higher standard of biosimilarity. There are different statutory criteria that reflect scientific considerations related to the potential for substitution of an interchangeable product without the intervention of the healthcare provider who prescribed that product for their patient. So an interchangeable biosimilar product can be substituted at the pharmacy without the prescriber knowing that it has been subject to state laws. But patients and their providers do not need to wait for a biosimilar to become an interchangeable product. There are different considerations that the manufacturer may consider in deciding whether to seek licensure for their product as biosimilar or as interchangeable. And in fact, there's misinformation that FDA is working hard to dispel, that somehow the interchangeable product is better than a biosimilar, when in fact, the product themselves, the biologic that's manufactured would be the same, whether it's biosimilar, approved as biosimilar, or interchangeable. And this misinformation can have a negative impact on the uptake of all biosimilars by increasing this confusion. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a couple questions that came in for Dr. Kimberly Maxfield. And here is the first question for Dr. Maxfield. What metrics is FDA using to measure the success of the pilot program?
Thank you for that question. In general, we see regulatory impact as the effect of the effect on FDA recommendations that are usually science-based, or are always science-based, excuse me, and or regulatory decision-making. As such, we created the draft research priorities and the regulatory goals for the pilot program into in areas that where scientific and regulatory advancement is expected to inform the science-based recommendations and regulatory decision-making. Additionally, we would consider an effort that achieves a critical milestone towards informing a science-based recommendation or regulatory decision, also part of our regulatory impact definition. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have got another question for Dr. Maxfield, and here's the question. Can you share some of the challenges that the FDA has seen in the development and approval of biosimilars that this pilot aims to address?
Thanks for that question. Another really great question. There are many different components to biosimilar development and delivery in the healthcare setting. Typically, FDA's purview, and particularly for biosimilars, is really focusing on the cost of development and time to licensure of biosimilars and interchangeable. There are, as I mentioned, many cooks in the kitchen related to patient access, and from the FDA perspective, we are trying to make biosimilar development as efficient and predictable as possible to ensure that the approved products meet the same high standards for quality, safety, and efficacy as their reference products. And we hope that some of the research that we engage in will address some of the uncertainties and result in greater, that will address the greater data expectations so we can reduce those gaps. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist. We've got a few questions that did come in for Elizabeth Thompson, and here is the first question for Ms. Thompson. Is it acceptable for a sponsor to discuss with an FDA project manager prior to submitting a Type D meeting request or briefing package, whether the topic is narrow enough?
Thank you for that question. So I would first encourage all sponsors to utilize all of FDA's resources to include the draft guidances that are out there on formal meetings. If you still have questions regarding whether or not it's an appropriate meeting type or what type of meeting to request, so in this case, if you're trying to determine whether or not the topic for a Type D meeting is within the scope, after you've reached out and looked at the guidances, yes, I would say it is acceptable to approach your assigned FDA regulatory project manager in order to ask those questions. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next question for Ms. Thompson is the following. Are Interact meetings only applicable to biological products or is molecules?
Thank you for that question. That's another good question. Interact meetings are applicable to all products, so all of CDER products to include the biological products and also small molecules. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more longer questions from Ms. Thompson that came in, and here's the first one. We can repeat it if needed. What is the difference between a face-to-face meeting that is virtual with cameras on, as defined in recent FDA updates on face-to-face meetings, and a video conference as defined in the current FDA guidance on formal meetings with the agency? Also, if a sponsor wants a virtual meeting where they can present slides and just speakers are on camera, not necessarily everyone participating, which type of format should be requested?
Thank you again for that question. So there's no difference between what we are calling a video conference and a virtual meeting. So FDA has defined 3 formal meeting types, those being a face-to-face meeting, a teleconference, and a written response only. For a face-to-face meeting, those are separated out a little bit more into what we call an in-person meeting, which can also be done hybrid, and then the video conference or virtual. And so if you are looking at requesting a virtual meeting with FDA where you present slides and the speakers are on camera, that would be considered a video conference. For video conferences, they are not limited to the amount of people that go on camera. So if there's going to be any participant that goes on camera to include the speakers, then we would call that a video conference. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more from Ms. Thompson, and here's the question. Can you clarify if a meeting specifically focused on delivery device development, for example, risks, specifications, testing, is in the scope of an Interact meeting before a pre-IND for the combination product has been conducted?
Thank you. That's another great question. So as I noted in my presentation, Interact meetings are intended for novel questions and unique challenges. And if we are looking at this question is asking about
a novice or a novice delivery device, this would fit into what we call an interact meeting. Those do relate to the development of innovative devices used with a drug or biologic, to include combination products. So this would this type of meeting would fall under an interact meeting. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving back up to the beginning of our panel, we've got a few more questions that came in for Dr. Ricci. And here is the first question. Can you elaborate on the differences between a Category B and a Category D supplement, since they both are to add indications but have different review timelines?
Hi, sure. The Category B supplement would seek to add an indication to an already approved biosimilar where either the application is not including a product that would be administered through a different route of administration than had previously been approved for the biosimilar. And it wouldn't also be a different dosage form, strength, formulation, or presentation, such as device. It also would, the application would include an agreed upon initial pediatric study plan that would address the requirements under the PREA statute for the additional indication that's being proposed to be added. Those conditions wouldn't apply for a Category D supplement. So a Category D supplement could include information to support, say, a new strength, dosage form, route of administration, or presentation that would be used for the patients that new indication is intended to treat. It also wouldn't need to have an up-to-date, agreed upon initial pediatric study plan. And in that supplement, the applicant would include their plan for addressing PREA in the supplement, along with any other information to support the approval of the biosimilar for that new indication. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question for Dr. Ricci at this time, and here's the question. Where can I find information about the analytical and clinical studies that were done to support FDA's decision to approve biosimilar and interchangeable products?
Sure. That information would be included in the reviews that are posted at the Drugs at FDA website, that for all new drugs and biologics approved by CDER. So you could go to just type into your web browser, Drugs at FDA, and it'll take you to that web page, and then you can search on the product that you're looking for. And the reviews that FDA wrote to that would include the basis for the approval would all be contained in that website.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we have a couple more questions that came in for Dr. Kimberly Maxfield, and here's the first question for Dr. Maxfield. How is FDA engaging their stakeholders to obtain input on the pilot program?
Great question, thank you. The pilot program has several key deliverables and stakeholder engagements that are part of the commitment that can be seen in the actual commitment letter, which is the interim report and public meeting, the final report, and then the strategy document within 12 months of completion of the demonstration projects. But additionally to those engagements, we have been engaging through the continuous engagement meetings that are include the BsUFA 3 negotiation individuals and groups that are usually held bi or triannually. We had one back in February, early February, that talked about the REdI program. Additionally, with the regulatory roadmap that highlighted our 10 research priorities, we had a public comment period on that draft roadmap from January through the beginning of April, and are now looking at the comments that were submitted and revising that roadmap now. And from our actual reviewers for the actual grant applications that are undergoing review right now, we have elicited external to FDA reviewers, some external to FDA reviewers to help with that review. And our first round of funded projects will be submitting their annual report shortly, and we've requested from those grantees that we can make those reports public, so we're as transparent as possible with our progress. Additionally, we're exploring other options of additional public meetings or public webinars beyond, so in additional to that interim on or before October 25th, 2025, we're looking at other forums that can gain additional input. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions that came in from Dr. Maxfield, and here is the next question. What is the process, the timeline for the funding announcements as part of the regulatory science program?
Thank you for that question. For external funding announcements, we follow the Office of Acquisition and Grant Services timeline, which is part of which follows HHS policy. So there's a pretty defined timeline on when and how we put out the funding announcements. And so typically they will go out sometime in the late calendar year, early of the following calendar year. And then they'll be out for between 60 and 90 days. And then we'll do our objective review process, which again is part of the HHS external grant policy. And then the grantees will receive those comments and those scores before as final funding recommendations. So the whole process can take anywhere from 6 to 8 months as we follow the HHS process that's defined for us. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question for Dr. Maxfield, and it's the following. When is the next external funding cycle?
Great question. So we are in the process of negotiating that right now, or thinking about what that would look like. We are currently reviewing the applicants from this last funding cycle. I think once we get through that review, hopefully have some type of public webinar this fall, I think we'll get enough stakeholder feedback to inform that decision. So really ultimately this is similar to the previous question. We really want external input on sort of what gaps people would like to see, and how, and sort of at what timeline that would be helpful for. So I think look out sometime this fall for an announcement about that. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we've got a few more questions that came in for Elizabeth Thompson, and here's the first question for Ms. Thompson. Can you please remind me which type of meetings will be provided face-to-face in priority?
Thank you for that question. So in February, we announced our phased approach on our public website, and we started our in-person face-to-face meetings with Type A BPD type 1 and type X meetings. Recently, we announced on our website that beginning on June 12th, that we will expand in-person face-to-face industry meetings with a hybrid component to include requests for type B end of phase 2 meetings. And so those will be in addition to the ones that we have previously announced. I do want to say that face-to-face meeting requests for other meeting types, if granted, will be held virtually, so the in-person format will not be considered. And also just to note that existing meeting requests received before June 12th, as this is our most recent announcement that we made, or meetings that are already scheduled, regardless of the scheduled meeting date, won't be converted to an in-person format. And this is just in order for us to permit fair implementation of this transition. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions that just came in from Ms. Thompson, and here's the next question. How many in-person face-to-face meetings has the agency had?
Thank you. Great question. So as of May 31st of this year, FDA has received 10 qualified requests for in-person face-to-face meetings per the phase 1 eligibility criteria. So again, this is type A, BPD type 1, and type X. For all of our PDUFA, BsUFA, and OMUFA programs, all 10 of these requests were granted with an in-person component. We've held 6 of these meetings so far successfully, and the remaining 4 that are scheduled should be completed in the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Got another question on face-to-face meetings, and it's the following. When will all meeting types be eligible for in-person face-to-face meetings?
Thank you for that question. So once our full complement of conference rooms, and so those are the conference rooms that we used prior to the pandemic for non-hybrid meetings, once they've all been upgraded to accommodate successful in-person face-to-face meetings with a hybrid component, then the FDA will move to our final phase of transition, which will expand eligibility of in-person face-to-face meetings to all formal meeting types. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions that just came in from Ms. Thompson. And here's the next question. We requested a face-to-face, but we received a written response only. Can we negotiate?
Yes, great question. So when FDA receives meeting requests, upon review, we determine whether or not that a written response to the sponsor's questions is the most appropriate means for providing feedback and advice to the sponsor. So if you have requested a face-to-face meeting, but received a written response only, and you believe that a face-to-face meeting would be more valuable, then the sponsor should provide a rationale and a follow-up correspondence to your assigned regulatory project manager, explaining why you feel a face-to-face meeting is more valuable and warranted. FDA will review your rationale and determine if a face-to-face meeting is appropriate at that time. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have just under a minute left, and we have to try to squeeze in one more question from Ms. Thompson we just received. And here's the question. How do sponsors share presentations at in-person hybrid or virtual-only face-to-face meetings?
Thank you for that question. So first, I want to say that presentations by sponsors are generally not needed because the information for a meeting discussion should be part of the meeting package. However, if a meeting requester plans to make a presentation, they should discuss it ahead of time with their assigned FDA project manager in order to determine if this presentation is warranted, and then also to ensure that FDA has the presentation materials ahead of the meeting. For our in-person, hybrid, or virtual-only face-to-face meetings, we are conducting those through Zoom. Therefore, sponsors will be able to present using that IT platform. Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have for questions in this Q&A panel. A huge thank you to our presenters for answering numerous questions that came in. We'll now enter into our lunch break time until 12:45 p.m. Eastern Time. Enjoy your break.